A boiled human head spiked on London Bridge shouldn't keep a king awake at night. Yet, for 2 weeks, Bishop John Fisher's severed head refused to rot under the summer sun. Keeping a flushed, lifelike gaze toward the royal palace, it drove terrified citizens to their knees. This macabre sight forced a panicked Henry VIII to secretly dump the relic into the River Thames. This brutal end happened simply because Fisher dared to stand in the way of the king's lust. When Henry demanded to discard his wife for Anne Boleyn, the old bishop refused to play along. Right in the middle of the court, Fisher looked Henry in the eye and condemned the affair as despicable adultery. He gladly accepted the executioner's axe rather than bowed to a tyrant. His story begins far away from the lethal politics of London. He was born around the year 1469 in Beverley. This was a bustling, prosperous market town in the East Riding of Yorkshire. Fisher was not born into the elite land-owning aristocracy. His family was firmly, comfortably middle class. His father, Robert Fisher, was a successful merchant, likely making a solid living in the lucrative textile and mercantile trades of the North. This background is crucial. It meant John Fisher understood the practical working world, even as his mind gravitated toward the divine. His father died when John was only 8 years old. In the 15th century, the loss of a patriarch could easily plunge a middle-class family into poverty, but his mother, Agnes, remarried and ensured that her son's education continued without interruption. He was enrolled in the local grammar school connected to the Minster in Beverley. Within those stone walls, his exceptionally sharp intellect became obvious to every master who taught him. He possessed a mind built for rigorous scholastic endurance. By the time he was 13 or 14 years old, an exceptionally young, highly unusual age even for the accelerated standards of the era, his masters realized they had taught him everything they could. He was sent south to study at Cambridge University. When John Fisher arrived at Cambridge in the early 1480s, it was not the glittering, globally renowned institution it is today. Many historians note that at the time English universities were somewhat isolated. They were steeped in heavy, outdated medieval scholasticism, lagging slightly behind the explosive intellectual awakenings happening in Italy and France. Fisher was not merely a student within this system, he was an absolute prodigy. Contemporary university records show a rapid, brilliant ascent. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in 1487. He earned his Master of Arts in 1491. His academic brilliance was matched only by his profound ascetic spiritual devotion. His vocation was so clear and his intellectual maturity so undeniable that the church made a rare exception for him. He was granted a special papal dispensation to be ordained as a Catholic priest at the age of 22, months before he had reached the strict canonical age requirement. He was elected a Fellow of Michael House, his college, and quickly became its master. But a brilliant mind in the late 15th century needed more than just a library to truly change the world. To enact massive structural change, an academic needed the protection and the financial backing of a powerful patron. John Fisher found the most powerful, influential patron in all of England. Her name was Margaret Beaufort. Margaret Beaufort was the mother of King Henry VII. She was the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty and the grandmother of the future king, Henry VIII. She was a woman who had survived the bloody, treacherous decades of the Wars of the Roses through sheer political genius. By the late 1490s, she possessed vast, almost unimaginable wealth. Furthermore, she possessed a deep, austere, highly rigorous Catholic piety. In 1498, Margaret Beaufort invited the young, brilliant academic from Cambridge to dine with her. The meeting was a profound meeting of the minds. Shortly after, she dismissed her current spiritual staff and appointed John Fisher as her personal confessor. It was a partnership that would completely reshape the landscape of English education. Margaret Beaufort had intended to leave her extensive accumulated fortune to the great Abbey of Westminster. However, as her spiritual advisor, Fisher gently but firmly redirected her vast resources. He convinced her that the future of the church and the future of the nation did not rely on building more stained glass windows for monks. It relied on educating a new, brilliant generation of priests and secular scholars. Together, the royal matriarch and the scholar looked at Cambridge University and decided to pull it into the modern age. With Margaret's royal wealth and Fisher's academic vision, they executed a master class in educational reform. Under Fisher's direct guidance, Margaret Beaufort heavily funded the expansion of Cambridge. They completely revitalized existing institutions and founded Christ College in 1505. Before her death, they laid the complex groundwork and secured the immense funding for the creation of St. John's College, which would formally open a few years later. But Fisher did not just want to build physical stone walls. He wanted to build and refine human minds. His peers recognized his transformative power. In 1504, the university elected him as chancellor. It was a position of such profound influence that they would eventually grant it to him for life. As chancellor, Fisher single-handedly dragged English academia out of the medieval darkness and directly into the blinding light of the Renaissance. He aggressively modernized the curriculum. Prior to Fisher, theology was often a matter of reading medieval commentaries on other medieval commentaries. Fisher demanded that students go back to the original sources. He controversially introduced the rigorous study of ancient Greek and Hebrew to the Cambridge curriculum. This was a radical, highly progressive move. It allowed English scholars to read the original biblical texts and the early church fathers in their native languages, stripping away centuries of poor Latin translations. He was so dedicated to the absolute highest tier of intellectual pursuit that he utilized his international reputation to pull off a sweeping academic coup. He personally convinced the great Dutch philosopher and intellectual giant Desiderius Erasmus to leave the continent. Erasmus came to live and teach at Cambridge, firmly putting the English university on the map of the European intellectual elite. Because of this unparalleled intellect and unshakable moral center, the royal family trusted John Fisher deeply. They trusted him so entirely that King Henry VII appointed the scholar to serve as the personal tutor to a young, robust royal prince. For a time, John Fisher was a highly respected presence in the royal apartments. While the poet John Skelton served as the official tutor to the young prince, many historical records suggest Fisher also played a profound guiding role in shaping the boy's early theological understanding. It is a dark irony of the Tudor era that this quiet scholar helped shape the spiritual environment of the exact monarch who would, decades later, maliciously sign his death warrant. The young prince who learned theology from the quiet scholar would one day transform into a ruthless dictator. But before the king's fragile ego fractured the peace of England, John Fisher was given a flock of his own. He was about to show the glittering, ambitious Tudor court exactly what a true prince of the church looked like. He would deliberately choose a life of punishing asceticism over the intoxicating temptations of royal power. In the highly political, fiercely ambitious hierarchy of the Tudor Catholic Church, a bishopric was rarely viewed merely as a spiritual calling. For many elite clerics, It was a lucrative financial asset. It was a stepping stone. In 1504, at the age of 35, John Fisher was appointed by King Henry VII as the Bishop of Rochester. If you look at a map of 16th century English dioceses, Rochester was geographically insignificant. It was a small, narrow slice of territory in Kent. But more importantly, for an ambitious courtier, it was exceptionally poor. It possessed a fraction of the vast, eye-watering wealth generated by prominent bishoprics like Winchester, Durham, or York. For the vast majority of Tudor clerics, being appointed to Rochester was a temporary inconvenience. It was a brief, necessary trial period to hold until a much wealthier, more prestigious seat opened up in the church hierarchy. John Fisher stayed in Rochester for 31 years. Throughout his incredibly long tenure, he flatly, consistently refused every single offer of promotion or transfer. When King Henry VII and later King Henry VIII offered him wealthier bishoprics, Fisher politely declined. He firmly believed in a traditional ancient theological concept. A bishop was spiritually married to his diocese. He famously remarked to his contemporaries that he would never abandon his poor, aging spiritual bride in search of a richer, more glamorous widow. This decision was not merely a rhetorical flourish. It was a deeply ingrained philosophy that dictated how he lived every single day. While many Renaissance cardinals and bishops lived like secular princes, throwing lavish banquets and accumulating immense personal fortunes, John Fisher embraced a life of extreme, punishing asceticism. He possessed an extensive, globally significant personal library. Many historians and bibliophiles consider it to have been one of the finest, most comprehensive collections of books in all of Europe. But his personal living conditions within the bishop's palace were deliberately, shockingly harsh. Contemporary chronicles from his household staff paint a vivid picture of a man at war with his own physical comfort. He slept on an exceptionally hard bed. He routinely gave his own warm blankets and expensive clothing away to the local poor, leaving himself freezing during the bitter English winters. He wore a coarse, painful hair shirt beneath his fine episcopal robes. He would personally visit the sick, the dying, and the destitute in his diocese, handing out food directly from his own dining table. Furthermore, John Fisher was a man deeply, uncomfortably obsessed with the fleeting, fragile nature of human life. He lived entirely in the shadow of eternity. To ensure he never became arrogant, and to guarantee he never became too comfortable with the immense secular power he yielded, Fisher utilized a startling psychological tool. He kept a real human skull on the altar while he celebrated the sacred Mass. He kept another skull positioned directly on his dining table. Every single time he ate a meal, every time he prayed, he was forced to stare directly into the hollow eye sockets of death. It was a physical memento mori. He was constantly reminding himself that worldly power was dust. He was a man who had completely made peace with his own mortality decades before the King of England ever threatened to take his life. It was exactly this unshakable moral foundation combined with his towering intellect that made him the ultimate weapon when the Catholic Church faced its greatest existential crisis. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther published his 95 Theses. The Protestant Reformation exploded across the European continent. It was a theological earthquake that threatened to completely topple the established order of the Christian world. The English crown, deeply conservative at the time, desperately needed a defender. They needed an intellectual heavyweight who could go toe-to-toe with Luther's brilliant, fiery rhetoric. John Fisher, immediately stepped forward to the front lines of the theological battlefield. He did not fight with swords. He fought with the pulpit, and he fought with the printing press. Fisher preached sweeping, highly publicized sermons against Martin Luther. He frequently spoke at St. Paul's Cross in London, the most important public preaching venue in the entire nation. Thousands of Londoners would gather to hear the Bishop of Rochester dismantle Protestant theology. In May of 1521, Fisher orchestrated a highly visual, terrifying display of state and religious power. He stood before a vast, hushed crowd in London. With the full backing of the King and Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Fisher officially presided over the public burning of Martin Luther's books. As the flames consumed the heretical texts, Fisher delivered a blistering 2-hour sermon condemning the new religious movement. But Fisher was a scholar. He knew perfectly well that sermons and bonfires were temporary spectacles. The battle for the soul of Europe had to be decisively won in print. In 1521, King Henry VIII famously published a book titled The Defense of the Seven Sacraments. It was a scathing, highly educated rebuke of Martin Luther. The book was a monumental propaganda victory for the English crown. Pope Leo X was so thrilled with the text that he officially granted King Henry the prestigious hereditary title Defender of the Faith, a title that British monarchs still hold on their coinage today. However, behind the closed doors of the royal court, the authorship was heavily debated. While the king undoubtedly contributed to the structure and the arguments, many historians and theological experts heavily suspect that John Fisher was the true author, or at the very least, the primary theological architect of the royal book. Fisher possessed the deep, specialized knowledge of the early church fathers required to write it. He provided the intellectual heavy lifting so the king could wear the glory. But Fisher did not stop there. He went on to write his own comprehensive, definitive theological defense. It was a sprawling, densely argued Latin text called the Confutation of Luther's Assertions. It was hundreds of thousands of words long. Across the capitals of Europe, from Rome to Madrid, John Fisher was widely viewed as the ultimate, unbreachable bulwark against the rising tide of Protestantism. He was the golden intellectual shield of the Tudor state. But this highly successful, deeply entrenched partnership between the brilliant bishop and the powerful king was destined to shatter. And it shattered entirely over the king's desperate desire for a new woman. By the late 1520s, King Henry VIII was a man consumed by dynastic panic. His first wife, the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, had suffered multiple tragic miscarriages and stillbirths. She had failed to provide the king with a living, healthy male heir to secure the Tudor line. She was now past childbearing age. Henry's eyes and his immense lust had wandered to a young, charismatic woman in the queen's entourage named Anne Boleyn. But Anne refused to be a mere mistress. The king needed a legal way out of his marriage so he could take a new bride and build his dynasty. He initiated what became known throughout Europe simply as the king's great matter. To divorce a legally wedded anointed queen, the king needed a theological loophole. He needed the Pope to declare that the marriage to Catherine had never been valid in the first place. Henry and his advisors scoured the scriptures. They pointed triumphantly to the biblical book of Leviticus. Chapter 20, verse 21 explicitly stated, "If a man takes his brother's wife, it is an impurity. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless." This was Henry's golden ticket. Because Queen Catherine had briefly been married to Henry's older brother, Prince Arthur, before Arthur died as a teenager, Henry formulated a terrifying argument. He argued that by marrying his brother's widow, he had violated the direct law of God. He claimed his marriage was cursed, and his lack of a male heir was divine punishment. The Pope's original dispensation allowing the marriage, Henry argued, was spiritually illegal. Henry brought this carefully constructed argument to the greatest legal and theological minds in England. He fully expected them to bow to his will, agree with his interpretation, and give him exactly what he wanted. John Fisher took the king's argument, placed it under the microscope of his immense intellect, and completely systematically dismantled it. Fisher, the greatest theologian in the land, was not afraid of the king's wrath. He pointed the king and his desperate ministers directly toward another book of the Bible, the book of Deuteronomy. He specifically cited the ancient law of the levirate. This biblical law explicitly stated the exact opposite of the king's interpretation. Deuteronomy 25:5 dictated that if a man died without children, his surviving brother was absolutely legally required to marry the widow. He was commanded to raise up seed to carry on his dead brother's family line. Fisher eloquently and forcefully argued that King Henry had not committed a sin by marrying Catherine of Aragon. On the contrary, he had actually fulfilled a sacred biblical duty. Therefore, the Pope's original dispensation for the marriage was entirely valid, legally sound, and spiritually unbreakable. Fisher had utterly shattered King Henry's legal and theological excuse for an annulment, effectively closing the only door the king had found. By fiercely defending the levirate law, he protected the queen with what he viewed as the ironclad laws of Scripture. Crucially, the Bishop of Rochester did not keep these profound theological convictions confined to a quiet, private letter. He prepared to take this theological battle to the most public, most dangerous arena in the entire kingdom. The stage was set for a direct, catastrophic confrontation between the absolute power of the crown and the unyielding conscience of a single man. The turning point of the English Reformation did not occur on a battlefield. It occurred inside a sweltering, crowded courtroom in London. By the summer of 1529, King Henry VIII's desperation to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had reached a fever pitch. International diplomacy had stalled. The Pope, essentially a political prisoner of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, was deliberately stalling for time. To resolve the crisis, a special legatine court was convened at the Dominican Priory of Blackfriars. This was not an ordinary legal proceeding. It was a grand, highly theatrical display of royal and papal authority. The Pope had sent a special envoy, Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio, to preside over the trial alongside Henry's own chief minister, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. The entire English court, including the king and the queen, was present. The atmosphere inside Blackfriars was suffocating. It was designed to intimidate. It was designed to force anyone who opposed the king's will into terrifying, absolute silence. Queen Catherine famously provided the most dramatic moment of the trial, throwing herself at Henry's feet and begging for justice before sweeping out of the courtroom. But she was a foreign princess fighting for her life. The king expected her to resist. What the king did not expect was a betrayal from within his own intellectual ranks. On June 28, 1529, the court reconvened. The king's lawyers had just presented their complex, highly polished theological arguments as to why the royal marriage was cursed by God. The room fell silent, expecting the routine confirmation of the king's brilliance. Instead, a frail 60-year-old man in bishop's robes stood up. John Fisher stepped into the center of the court. He did not ask for permission to speak. He did not offer groveling apologies to the sovereign. Fisher, fully aware of the lethal danger he was stepping into, publicly defended Queen Catherine. He addressed the papal legates directly. In a booming, unwavering voice, Fisher declared that the royal marriage was valid, sacred, and absolutely unbreakable by any earthly court. He presented the judges with a meticulously researched book he had written, detailing the theological impossibility of the king's divorce. Fisher told the stunned, completely silent courtroom that he was willing to lay down his life to defend the sanctity of this specific marriage. Then the Bishop of Rochester made a highly calculated, legally fatal comparison. He likened himself to St. John the Baptist. In the deeply religious society of Tudor England, every single person in that courtroom knew the biblical story. John the Baptist was the holy prophet who had publicly condemned King Herod for entering into an unlawful, lust-driven marriage with his brother's wife, Herodias. For his defiance, John the Baptist was imprisoned and brutally beheaded. The implication of Fisher's metaphor was unmistakable. It was profoundly, unforgivably insulting. By calling himself John the Baptist, Fisher was publicly branding King Henry VIII as a lust-driven, tyrannical King Herod. He was branding Anne Boleyn as the wicked Herodias. And he was predicting his own violent death. He had humiliated the King of England in front of the Pope's ambassador, the highest lords of the realm, and the watching eyes of Europe. King Henry's massive ego was bruised beyond repair. Contemporary chronicles show that Henry was so violently enraged by Fisher's speech that he personally drafted a furious, rambling Latin manuscript in response, directly attacking his former tutor's arrogance. From that exact moment, in 1529, the intellectual partnership was dead. John Fisher was a marked man. The king could not simply send his guards to arrest Fisher and chop off his head. Fisher was entirely too popular with the common people. He was too internationally respected as a scholar. He was too highly ranked in the Catholic Church. Executing a bishop without absolute, undeniable proof of treason would invite international war and domestic rebellion. The Tudor state had to trap him legally, or, more conveniently, they had to eliminate him quietly. What followed was a terrifying multi-year shadow war. The intellectual debate was replaced by a campaign of physical intimidation and attempted murder. In early 1531, a horrific incident occurred at Fisher's London residence, a sprawling ecclesiastical palace located in Lambeth. The bishop was preparing to host a dinner for his household staff and a few guests. In the kitchen, a man named Richard Roos, who may have been a cook or someone who had infiltrated the staff, managed to slip a deadly unknown poison into a large pot of yeast-based porridge or soup that was simmering on the fire. By sheer historical luck, John Fisher had lost his appetite that day. He was deeply engrossed in his studies and ate almost nothing, deciding to fast. But the poison was brutally real. The household staff consumed the contaminated soup. Within hours, the palace was plunged into chaos. People began convulsing in horrific agony. Two people, a gentleman of Fisher's household named Benny Kerwin and a poor widow named Alice Trippus, who had come to the kitchen for charity, died in excruciating pain. Fisher himself, who had perhaps tasted a spoonful, became violently ill but narrowly survived. The poisoning sent shockwaves through London. The idea that a sitting bishop could be assassinated in his own home was terrifying. King Henry VIII's reaction to this event is highly debated by historians. Henry publicly exploded in fury, rushing the horrifying acte for poisoning through Parliament to boil the assassin alive. Some historians argue that the king was genuinely appalled by the cowardly nature of poison and felt a real threat to social order. However, others suspect that a rogue faction acting on behalf of the Boleyn family might have orchestrated the attempt. While absolute proof remains elusive, the chilling message to John Fisher was clear. His physical safety was permanently compromised. Shortly after the poisoning, a second, even more brazen act of violence occurred. Fisher was sitting in his private study at his Lambeth Palace. The palace was located directly across the River Thames from the king's own residence. Suddenly, a devastating gunshot, likely a heavy lead ball fired from a small cannon or a heavy musket, shattered the roof of his study. The heavy projectile smashed through the tiles and the timber, completely destroying the peaceful sanctuary of the bishop's library. While the exact intent remains heavily debated by modern historians, some viewing it as a deliberate assassination attempt from the Boleyn faction, others as a terrifyingly close stray shot, John Fisher realized that the Shadow War had escalated into open violence. He could no longer safely remain in the capital. He retreated to the country, hoping that distance would cool the king's wrath. But the king's anger was only just beginning to formalize into a much more insidious campaign. A stray cannonball through a study roof was a clumsy, amateurish method of assassination, and the Tudor state quickly changed its tactics. King Henry VIII and his rapidly rising chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, realized they needed a much more sophisticated weapon. If physical force could not quietly silence the frail Bishop of Rochester, they decided to deploy the terrifying, inescapable machinery of the English legal system to publicly trap him. If they could not legally murder John Fisher, they would financially and politically suffocate him. By the end of 1530, the king's great matter, his desperate quest to divorce Catherine of Aragon, was completely stalled. The Pope refused to grant the annulment. The king was trapped in a legally binding marriage. His frustration mutated into a dangerous, sweeping radicalization. Thomas Cromwell, a shrewd, legally trained political operator, whispered a revolutionary idea into the king's ear. If the Pope in Rome would not grant the divorce, the King of England should simply fire the Pope. Henry should take absolute supreme control of the English Church himself. But to do this, the crown had to break the independent spirit of the English clergy. And to break the clergy, they had to break their intellectual champion, John Fisher. In late 1530 and early 1531, King Henry VIII revived an obscure, highly complex medieval law. It was called the Statute of Praemunire. Originally passed in the 14th century, this law was designed to prevent English subjects from appealing to foreign powers, specifically the papacy, over the authority of the English crown. For generations, the law had largely been ignored. The English Church operated in a delicate shared balance of power between London and Rome. Henry weaponized this ancient statute with devastating blanketing effect. He did not just charge John Fisher. He formally accused the entire English clergy of committing praemunire. The charge was breathtaking. He claimed that by recognizing the Pope's legal authority, every single priest, abbot, and bishop in the country had committed an act of treason against the king. The penalty for praemunire was catastrophic. It meant the complete forfeiture of all lands, all goods, and all personal liberty to the crown. The king held a legal knife to the throat of the entire Catholic Church in England. Henry offered them a heavy, humiliating pardon. To buy their way out of this fabricated legal crisis, the clergy of the Convocation of Canterbury had to pay the king a crushing, extortionate fine of £100,000. In the 16th century, this was an astronomical sum. It would bankrupt monasteries and drain the church's coffers. But the money was only the first part of the ransom. The king demanded something far more dangerous. He demanded that the convocation officially, legally recognize him as the sole protector and supreme head of the English church and clergy. This title was a theological earthquake. It completely severed England from 1,000 years of Catholic tradition. It placed a secular, worldly politician at the absolute head of a spiritual institution. The English clergy were absolutely terrified. They were facing financial ruin and mass imprisonment. They gathered in the convocation, deeply panicked, ready to completely capitulate to the king's tyrannical demands. But John Fisher, despite his advanced age, his physical frailty, and the recent attempts on his life, traveled from the safety of Rochester back into the lion's den. He stepped into the convocation and orchestrated a master class in legal and theological resistance. Fisher knew he could not simply tell the clergy to refuse the king. Henry would destroy them all. He had to find a legal loophole that would pacify the king's temper without sacrificing the eternal soul of the church. He analyzed the king's demanded title. Then Fisher proposed adding just 5 specific, highly calculated Latin words to the end of the king's document. He convinced the terrified clergy to agree to the king's new title, but only with this strict conditional clause, quantum per Christi legem licet. Translated into English, this phrase meant they recognized Henry as the supreme head of the church, as far as the law of Christ allows. It was a stroke of absolute, breathtaking legal genius. To the casual observer, it looked as though the clergy had surrendered. King Henry VIII received the document, saw his new title, and accepted the £100,000. But to any trained theologian, John Fisher had just entirely neutralized the king's supreme power. Fisher knew, and the king's own lawyers quickly realized, that according to Orthodox Catholic doctrine, the law of Christ absolutely did not allow a secular earthly king to govern the spiritual church. That authority was explicitly given to St. Peter and his papal successors. Fisher had given the king the exact words he demanded, but he had completely stripped them of any actual legal or theological authority. It was a polite, elegantly disguised, but legally binding no. When the king and Thomas Cromwell realized they had been outmaneuvered by the frail Bishop of Rochester, their fury was profound. The premunire trap had failed to break Fisher's conscience, so Cromwell began designing a new, far more dangerous snare. This time, he would not attack the entire clergy. He would target Fisher directly, and he would use a vulnerable young woman to do it. By 1533, the political landscape had reached a breaking point. King Henry VIII had secretly married a pregnant Anne Boleyn. He had ordered Archbishop Thomas Cranmer to formally, legally declare his marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void. Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England. The public was outraged. They loved Catherine. They deeply resented Anne. And in the county of Kent, right in the heart of John Fisher's own diocese, a powerful voice of public dissent arose. Her name was Elizabeth Barton. She was widely known as the Holy Maid of Kent. Elizabeth Barton was a young, deeply religious Catholic nun. For several years, she had been experiencing intense, highly publicized spiritual visions and trances. Initially, the church authorities, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, had investigated her and declared her visions to be genuine miracles. She became an immensely popular, widely revered holy figure. But as the king's divorce proceedings escalated, Barton's prophecies turned dangerously, explicitly political. She began to prophesy directly against King Henry VIII. She claimed that God had spoken to her. She publicly declared that if Henry married Anne Boleyn, he would cease to be king in the eyes of God within a month, and he would die a villain's death. In Tudor England, prophesying the death of the sovereign was a capital crime. It was high treason. Because Elizabeth Barton operated within the Diocese of Rochester, and because she was a highly prominent religious figure, John Fisher had met with her. He was a renowned theologian. It was his exact job as a bishop to interview visionaries, to discern if their prophecies were of divine origin or mere fraud. Fisher listened to Barton's terrifying warnings about the king. He evaluated them. Crucially, he did not immediately run to Whitehall Palace to report her words to the King's Council. This was the exact misstep Thomas Cromwell had been patiently waiting for. In late 1533, the Tudor state moved violently to crush the Holy Maid of Kent. Cromwell ordered her arrest. Under severe, relentless interrogation, and likely the threat or application of torture, Barton's psychological defenses broke. She was forced to confess that her visions were entirely fraudulent, a claim heavily debated by modern historians. Barton and several of her close spiritual advisors were condemned to death without a trial through a brutal bill of attainder. They were dragged to Tyburn and hanged. But Thomas Cromwell used Barton's execution to cast a much wider, more lethal net. He drafted the parliamentary bill to explicitly include the Bishop of Rochester. Cromwell officially charged John Fisher with misprision of treason. Under English law, misprision of treason was the crime of knowing about a treasonous plot and actively failing to report it to the authorities. Cromwell argued that because Fisher had listened to Barton prophesy the king's death and had remained silent, he was legally complicit in her treason. Fisher fought back brilliantly from his home in Rochester. He was too sick to travel to London, suffering from severe fevers and exhaustion. He wrote eloquent, highly detailed letters of defense directly to the House of Lords and to Thomas Cromwell. Fisher's legal defense was ironclad. He pointed out that Elizabeth Barton had already spoken her prophecies directly to King Henry VIII in a personal meeting years earlier. Therefore, it was legally absurd to accuse Fisher of concealing information from the king that the king already explicitly knew. Furthermore, Fisher argued that as a Catholic priest, conversations regarding spiritual visions and the state of the king's soul were protected matters of conscience, not secular conspiracies. But in the courts of Henry VIII, legal brilliance was entirely useless against a predetermined verdict. Parliament, heavily bullied by Cromwell and terrified of the king's temper, passed the Bill of Attainder. They found the Bishop of Rochester officially guilty of misprision of treason. The punishment was devastating. Fisher was legally stripped of all his remaining personal property. The state seized his goods. He was slapped with a devastating fine of £300, an immense sum for a bishop who had deliberately lived a life of poverty and given his wealth to the poor. Finally, the sentence carried the threat of permanent imprisonment in the Tower of London at the king's pleasure. King Henry remitted the imprisonment portion of the sentence, perhaps fearing the public backlash of throwing a sick elderly bishop into a dungeon over a technicality. Fisher paid the massive fine, plunging his bishopric into severe debt. The Tudor state had successfully robbed him. They had publicly humiliated him. They had drained his resources and exhausted his fragile physical health. But to the profound frustration of the king, John Fisher's moral authority remained entirely unbroken. He still refused to endorse the king's new marriage. Thomas Cromwell realized that fines and property confiscations were simply not enough. To permanently silence the quiet conscience of the Bishop of Rochester, the state needed a new law. They needed a law that targeted thoughts, and a law that mandated absolute, unavoidable death. By the spring of 1534, the shadow war between the Tudor state and the Bishop of Rochester was over. The physical intimidation had failed. The financial ruin of the Prémunire trap had failed. John Fisher remained isolated in Rochester, stripped of his wealth, but his moral authority over the English people was entirely unbroken. King Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell realized that as long as Fisher drew breath, his silent, steadfast refusal to endorse the king's new religious order was a profound existential threat. They needed a legal mechanism to force him into the open. They needed a weapon that did not merely fine a man, but legally compelled him to either submit his soul to the king or forfeit his life. That weapon was forged in the halls of Parliament. It was officially called the First Succession Act. On the surface, the Act of Succession was a purely secular, political document. It was designed to legally solidify the king's new dynastic reality. The law required all prominent men in the country to swear a solemn, legally binding oath. This oath officially recognized that Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was null and void. Furthermore, it declared that the children of Henry and his new wife, Queen Anne Boleyn, were the true, exclusive, and legitimate heirs to the throne of England. To refuse the oath was to be declared guilty of misprision of treason, resulting in immediate imprisonment and the total loss of property. However, Thomas Cromwell was a master of legal traps. He had intentionally, brilliantly poisoned the pill. The danger for John Fisher did not lie in the core political demand of the act. The danger lay in the highly specific theological language embedded deep within the preamble to the oath. The preamble explicitly demanded that the swearer reject the authority of any foreign potentate, a direct, undeniable legal reference to the Pope in Rome. It also required the swearer to validate the king's ultimate spiritual supremacy over the English Church, and to agree that Henry's marriage to Catherine was inherently contrary to the laws of God. For a devout Orthodox Catholic theologian, swearing to this preamble was not an act of political loyalty. It was an act of profound, unforgivable heresy. It was a formal public denial of the Catholic faith. In April 1534, the king's commissioners summoned John Fisher to London. He was ordered to appear at Lambeth Palace to officially swear the oath of succession. Fisher knew exactly what this summons meant. He was 65 years old. He was suffering from chronic illnesses, severe exhaustion, and a deep aching frailty. He knew he was walking into a trap from which he would likely never return. Contemporary chronicles detail his heartbreaking departure from Rochester. Before leaving his bishopric for the final time, Fisher meticulously set his earthly affairs in order. He drafted his last will and testament. He distributed his remaining meager funds to the poor of his diocese. He rode out of Rochester surrounded by weeping citizens, offering them his final pastoral blessings from horseback. When Fisher arrived at Lambeth Palace, he stood before the king's high commissioners. The panel included his theological rival Archbishop Thomas Cranmer and the ruthless Lord Chancellor Thomas Audley. They presented the frail bishop with the parchment. They demanded he swear the oath. Fisher took the document. He read it with the careful, analytical eye of a lifelong scholar. Then, he delivered a response of breathtaking, precise intellectual clarity. Fisher stated that he had absolutely no objection to the secular political aspect of the law. He told the commissioners that he would willingly immediately swear to the new line of succession. He accepted that King Henry VIII possessed the worldly, secular power to dictate who inherited his earthly crown. If the king wanted Anne Boleyn's children to rule England, Fisher would legally swear obedience to them. But Fisher stated calmly, he could not and would not swear to the entire oath as it was written. He absolutely refused to endorse the theological preamble. He would not condemn the king's first marriage, and he would not reject the spiritual authority of the Pope. To do so, he argued, would be to knowingly damn his own eternal soul. On that exact same day, in that exact same building, the brilliant lawyer and former Lord Chancellor Thomas More was presented with the exact same oath. More offered the exact same nuanced, legally precise refusal. The commissioners were frustrated. Archbishop Cranmer, perhaps seeking a compromise to save the lives of England's two greatest intellectuals, quietly suggested to Thomas Cromwell that the king should simply accept their partial oaths. Cranmer argued that securing their public loyalty to the Boleyn succession was a massive political victory in itself. But King Henry VIII was not interested in political compromises. He was not interested in legal nuances. He demanded absolute, total psychological submission. When the king heard of Fisher's refusal, his response was absolute. On April 26, 1534, after a brief period of house arrest, the Bishop of Rochester was formally taken into state custody. He was placed on a heavily guarded barge. He was rowed down the River Thames, passing under the grim arches of London Bridge. He was brought to the Tower of London and handed over to the lieutenant of the Tower. John Fisher was locked inside the bell tower. It was a formidable, imposing stone structure within the fortress complex. The heavy iron doors slammed shut, plunging the elderly scholar into a world of freezing, terrifying isolation. The conditions of his imprisonment were deliberately, sadistically designed to break his physical body and his immense spirit. To understand his suffering, one must understand the brutal reality of the Tudor penal system. The state did not freely provide food, warmth, or comfortable bedding to prisoners. Prisoners, even high-ranking ones, were expected to pay for their own upkeep out of their own personal estates. But John Fisher had no estate left. The state had systematically stripped him of his wealth during the Premunire crisis and the Holy Maid of Kent affair. Upon his arrest for refusing the oath, the crown legally confiscated his final remaining assets. They even seized his legendary extensive personal library, boxing up his thousands of books and scattering them. Consequently, the Bishop of Rochester was rendered entirely destitute. He was a prisoner in a stone cell, and he had absolutely no money to buy food, firewood, or warm clothing from his jailers. The winter of 1534 into 1535 was recorded as exceptionally bitter and cold. Fisher was 65 years old, an advanced age for the era. His ascetic lifestyle had left him with very little physical reserve. Now he was locked in a freezing, damp, unheated stone room. He was given barely enough terrible, low-quality food to keep his heart beating. He was denied adequate blankets. He was strictly denied access to his beloved books, and he was denied the comfort of a visiting Catholic priest. The Crown was playing a highly calculated, deeply cynical waiting game. Thomas Cromwell and King Henry VIII knew that putting a sitting bishop on trial for his life was a geopolitical nightmare. It would outrage the Catholic powers of Europe. It would invite excommunication. Instead, the Tudor state hoped that the brutal, freezing winter in the bell tower would do the executioner's work for them. They calculated that if they starved and froze the frail old man, he would simply die a natural death of disease or exposure in his cell. If he died quietly in the dark, the king would be permanently rid of his greatest intellectual enemy without suffering the international political fallout of a public beheading. But the stubborn, highly disciplined scholar from Yorkshire refused to die. He sat in the freezing darkness for months. His body wasted away until surviving accounts describe him as little more than a skeleton draped in pale, sickly skin. Yet, his mind remained incredibly sharp, and his spirit remained unbroken. We know the exact horrifying extent of his suffering because of a desperate, surviving letter he wrote from his cell. In late 1534, Fisher managed to pen a letter directly to Thomas Cromwell. It is one of the most heartbreaking, poignant documents of the Tudor era. The great scholar, the former Chancellor of Cambridge University, was forced to beg the king's minister for the absolute most basic human necessities. Fisher wrote, "I have neither shirt nor suit, nor yet other clothes that are necessary for me to wear, but that be ragged and rent too shamefully. Notwithstanding, I might easily suffer that, if they would keep my body warm." He pleaded for a little fire in his cell to keep his thin blood from freezing. He begged for some better food, noting that his digestion was failing and the prison slop was killing him. He ended the letter by asking Cromwell to have pity on him, appealing to his basic Christian charity. Cromwell's exact response is lost to history, but the conditions in the tower barely improved. The state continued to apply the slow, crushing pressure of physical deprivation. However, news of the bishop's horrific treatment could not be contained behind the thick walls of the tower. Smugglers, sympathetic guards, and foreign ambassadors carried the whispers of Fisher's suffering across the English Channel. The news eventually reached the highest halls of the Vatican in Rome. In May of 1535, a new pope had recently ascended to the throne of St. Peter. Pope Paul III was horrified by the reports of the starving, freezing Bishop of Rochester. The Pope decided to intervene. He orchestrated a desperate, high-stakes diplomatic maneuver intended to save John Fisher's life. He believed that the King of England had forgotten the sacred, untouchable hierarchy of the global church. Pope Paul III officially, publicly elevated the imprisoned John Fisher to the rank of cardinal. He was assigned the titular church of San Vitale in Rome. This was not a mere honorific title. In 16th century geopolitics, a cardinal was a prince of the church. They possessed a level of international diplomatic immunity. They were the highest-ranking officials in the Christian world, second only to the Pope himself. The Pope calculated that King Henry VIII, no matter how tyrannical, angry, or desperate he had become, would never dare to legally execute a sitting cardinal. To murder a prince of the church would be a catastrophic violation of international norms. It would universally brand Henry as a heretic and a monster, virtually guaranteeing a holy war against England by the combined Catholic powers of France and the Holy Roman Empire. The Pope genuinely believed the red hat would function as an impenetrable absolute shield around the starving man in the bell tower. But the Pope deeply misunderstood the total, absolute psychological transformation of King Henry VIII. The king no longer cared about international norms. He no longer feared the Pope. He recognized no authority on earth or in heaven higher than his own royal will. When the news reached Whitehall Palace that the Pope was sending John Fisher the red hat of a cardinal, Henry VIII exploded in a fit of psychotic, unhinged rage. Later, Catholic chronicles and historical biographies record the king's terrifying, legendary reaction. Henry reportedly snarled to his trembling courtiers, "Let the Pope send him a hat, but I will provide that he shall have never a head to wear it on." The diplomatic shield had instantly morphed into a death warrant. The king's pride had been directly challenged by Rome. The existence of Cardinal Fisher was now an intolerable insult to the crown. King Henry VIII commanded his government that the old man in the tower must die. But Henry, always a tyrant who preferred the neat illusion of the law, still had a massive legal problem. Fisher's disciplined silence meant the state had no prosecutable evidence. To execute the bishop, the Tudor regime prepared to orchestrate one of the most legally corrupt betrayals in the history of English jurisprudence. Imagine a legal system so utterly desperate to legitimize a monarch's will that it resorts to sacrilegious deception. Picture a government that publicly boasts of its strict adherence to the law, yet privately sends its highest officers into a freezing dungeon to lie, cheat, and violate the most sacred oaths of the Christian faith. The machinery of death had suddenly stalled against the quiet resilience of one starving old man. To restart it, Cromwell knew he had to manufacture a crime out of thin air. The obstacle was the Treason Act of 1534. When Thomas Cromwell originally drafted this brutal legislation, Parliament had balked at its terrifying scope. The original draft made it a capital offense to simply deny the king's new title as Supreme Head of the Church. However, the members of Parliament, terrified for their own lives, forced a crucial, highly specific legal safeguard into the text. They inserted the word maliciously. Under the finalized law, it was high treason to maliciously deprive the king of his titles. John Fisher, the brilliant former chancellor of Cambridge University, completely understood this legal nuance. Since his imprisonment in the bell tower, he had maintained absolute, unyielding silence regarding the king's supremacy. Whenever the king's counselors arrived to interrogate him, he refused to engage. He knew that under the strict letter of English law, a man could not be executed for what he refused to say. Silence could never be legally construed as malicious. The Tudor state had the frail cardinal locked in a cell, but they had absolutely no prosecutable evidence to drag him to the executioner's block. If they put him on public trial without proof, Fisher would brilliantly expose the gaping hole in their case, humiliating the crown before the eyes of Europe. Therefore, Thomas Cromwell, the king's ruthless chief minister, deployed his most effective, ethically bankrupt legal fixer. His name was Richard Rich. He held the prestigious office of Solicitor General. Rich was an incredibly ambitious, highly intelligent, and entirely unscrupulous lawyer. He was a man willing to perform the darkest, most corrupt tasks of the Tudor state in exchange for wealth and political advancement. He was the perfect instrument for a state-sponsored assassination disguised as jurisprudence. On May 7, 1535, the heavy iron door of the bell tower swung open. Richard Rich stepped into the freezing, damp gloom of John Fisher's cell. The newly elevated cardinal of the Catholic Church had been stripped of every earthly comfort. Yet, despite being wrapped in rags within the freezing dampness, he maintained an aura of quiet, intimidating dignity. According to the testimony later presented in court, Rich spun a masterful psychological trap. The Solicitor General looked the starving old man in the eye and lied with chilling conviction, telling Fisher that he was not there as an interrogator. He claimed he was there as a highly confidential secret messenger sent directly by King Henry VIII himself. Rich told Fisher that the king was secretly suffering from a deeply troubled conscience regarding his new title as supreme head of the church. He claimed the king was spiritually lost and desperately wanted Fisher's private, honest, pastoral advice on the matter. To seal the deception, Richard Rich swore a profound oath. He swore on the king's honor, and he solemnly swore on his own immortal soul that whatever Fisher said in that cell would remain strictly, permanently confidential. Rich explicitly promised the cardinal that his words would be treated under the sacred, unbreakable seal of confession between a Catholic priest and a troubled soul. He guaranteed that no legal action would ever be taken based on his answer. It was an appeal perfectly tailored to destroy John Fisher. Fisher was a stubborn intellectual, but fundamentally, he was a dedicated pastor. He was a deeply Orthodox Catholic priest. Furthermore, he was the man who had personally tutored King Henry VIII when the king was just a boy. The idea that his former pupil was finally experiencing spiritual remorse, that the king was reaching out for genuine pastoral care, pierced through Fisher's disciplined legal armor. Acting in his capacity as a priest, fulfilling his sacred duty to counsel a soul in jeopardy, John Fisher finally spoke his mind. He looked at Richard Rich and told him the plain, unvarnished theological truth. Fisher stated that according to the laws of God and the history of the Christian faith, the King of England could not possibly be the supreme head of the church. That authority belonged exclusively to the Pope. The trap instantly, violently snapped shut. Richard Rich did not offer a theological rebuttal. He did not engage in debate. He immediately stood up, turned his back on the frail old man, and walked out of the freezing cell. He went directly to Thomas Cromwell and wrote down every single word Fisher had spoken. Rich used that private, spiritually protected, highly manipulated conversation as the sole foundational piece of evidence to formally charge John Fisher, Cardinal of the Catholic Church, with high treason. The betrayal was an act of profound, unprecedented legal and spiritual corruption. The Tudor state had essentially criminalized the sacrament of confession. With the fabricated evidence secured, the state moved with blinding speed to orchestrate the public spectacle of his death. On June 17, 1535, John Fisher was brought out of the Tower of London to face trial. The King's Council was acutely aware of the geopolitical optics. They could not technically put a sitting cardinal on trial in a secular court. Therefore, the state deliberately, legally stripped Fisher of all his clerical immunities. They completely ignored his elevation by the Pope. They forced him to stand trial not as a prince of the church, but as a common English layman named John Fisher Clerk. He was placed on a boat and rowed up the River Thames to Westminster Hall. Westminster Hall was the ancient grand epicenter of English law. It was a cavernous room with a magnificent hammer beam roof. It was the exact same room where 6 years earlier Fisher had stood up and publicly defended Queen Catherine of Aragon, humiliating the king. Now he was returning to that room as a condemned prisoner. The trial was a grotesque, meticulously choreographed sham. The bench was packed with the highest legal officers of the realm, men who were completely loyal to and utterly terrified of King Henry VIII. The panel of judges was led by the Lord Chancellor, Thomas Audley, Thomas Cromwell, and Thomas Cranmer. A jury of 12 men had been selected, heavily pressured to deliver the verdict the Crown demanded. John Fisher was profoundly weakened by his imprisonment, having to support himself against the wooden bar of the courtroom. Yet while his body was failing, his razor-sharp intellect and serene composure remained entirely intact, standing in stark contrast to the panicked urgency of the Crown's lawyers. When the charge of high treason was read, Fisher eloquently defended himself before the hostile judges. He did not deny speaking the words to Richard Rich. Instead, he systematically dismantled the legality of the charge by pointing directly to the Treason Act. He reminded the court that the law explicitly required a person to speak maliciously against the king. Fisher brilliantly argued that his words completely lacked malice. He did not need to recount the deceptive traps set in his cell. He simply anchored his defense on the sacred, unbreakable seal of pastoral care. He powerfully asserted that answering a direct spiritual question posed under a strict promise of immunity by the king's own envoy could never be legally construed as a malicious attack on the crown. In any impartial court, this ironclad legal defense would have exposed the state's deception perfectly and secured an immediate acquittal. But Westminster Hall in 1535 was not a place of justice. It was an abattoir disguised as a courtroom. Lord Chancellor Thomas Audley looked down from the bench. He did not possess the intellectual capacity to debate Fisher, so he simply bent the fundamental laws of England to fit the king's insatiable bloodlust. Audley ruled from the bench, establishing a terrifying, tyrannical legal precedent. He declared that the very act of denying the king's title was, by its very definition, inherently malicious. Audley ruled that the context of the conversation did not matter. The privacy of the cell did not matter. The trickery, the lies, and the promises of the Solicitor General did not matter. According to the Lord Chancellor, if the words left your mouth, the malice was legally assumed. It was a catastrophic ruling that completely destroyed the parliamentary safeguard written into the Treason Act. It essentially decreed that the Tudor state could lie to its citizens, entrap them, and then legally murder them for falling into the trap. The jury, composed of prominent men who were acutely aware that displeasing the king could result in their own imprisonment or ruin, did not deliberate for long. They quickly returned the only verdict the king would accept. They found the 65-year-old starving cardinal guilty of high treason. Lord Chancellor Audley donned the traditional black cap and delivered the horrifying mandatory sentence required for treason in Tudor England. He sentenced John Fisher to be drawn on a wooden hurdle through the muddy, filthy streets of London to the execution grounds at Tyburn. There he was to be hanged by the neck until half dead. It was the absolute maximum terror the state could inflict upon a human body. Fisher received the horrific sentence with absolute serene calm and was returned to the freezing darkness of the bell tower. But a quiet panic set in among the king's counselors. They realized the starving cardinal might simply die on the journey to Tyburn, denying the king his public spectacle. The final brutal act of the Tudor state against its greatest intellectual had to be slightly altered, bringing the executioner's axe to Tower Hill. At 5 o'clock in the morning, on June 22, 1535, the heavy silence of the bell tower was broken by the turning of an iron key. Sir William Kingston, the formidable lieutenant of the Tower of London, stepped into the freezing damp cell. His grim duty was to inform the prisoner that the hour had finally come. The king had signed the final warrant. The execution was scheduled for that very morning. Kingston looked down at John Fisher. After 14 months of deliberate state-sponsored deprivation, the 65-year-old cardinal had been pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. However, a profound, unshakable peace radiated from him. Many historical accounts record a remarkable, profoundly calm exchange between the two men. When Kingston delivered the death warrant, Fisher did not weep. He did not beg for his life. Instead, the exhausted scholar looked up at the lieutenant and made a very simple human request. He asked if he could sleep for just 2 more hours. He explained that he had rested poorly the night before, not out of fear, but due to his chronic, racking illnesses. Kingston, perhaps moved by the sheer dignity of the frail old man, agreed. He locked the door and let the condemned cardinal sleep. When Fisher finally woke at 7 o'clock, he called for his servant. He gave a specific, highly unusual order. He asked the servant to help him dress in his absolute finest, cleanest clothes. He requested his fur tippet and his best unsoiled shirt. His servant was confused and deeply distressed. Weeping, the man asked his master why he cared so much about his physical appearance. He asked why he was dressing up on the very day his body was going to be brutally butchered on a public scaffold. John Fisher looked at his weeping servant and smiled. He replied with a sentence that has echoed through history. "Dost thou not mark that this is our marriage day?" Fisher did not view the impending execution as a political defeat. He viewed it as his ultimate spiritual victory. He was a bishop preparing to finally meet the divine bridegroom he had served his entire life. He was preparing for a holy union, and he intended to arrive dressed appropriately for the occasion. Because of his severe starvation, Fisher was entirely too weak to walk the grueling distance from the bell tower to the execution grounds. The tower guards had to bring a simple wooden chair. They lifted the frail cardinal into it and carried him out into the morning light toward the towering wooden structure on Tower Hill. As he was being carried through the crowds, Fisher held a small worn copy of the New Testament. He opened the pages at random, seeking a final piece of divine comfort. According to contemporary witnesses, his eyes fell directly on the Gospel of John, chapter 17, verses 3 and 4. The text reads, "And this is life eternal, that they might know thee, the only true God. I have glorified thee on the earth. I have finished the work which thou gavest me to do." Fisher read the words quietly. Then he closed the book forever. He looked at the heavily armed guards carrying his chair and said, "Here is even learning enough for me to my life's end." When the procession finally reached the base of the massive wooden scaffold, the enormous London crowd fell into a stunned, heavy silence. They were looking at a man who appeared already dead, but Fisher refused to show any fear. He politely but firmly waved away the hands of the guards who tried to physically carry him up the final wooden steps. Using the absolute last reserves of his strength, he walked up to the executioner's block on his own 2 feet. He stood at the wooden rail. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying over the silent crowd. He did not deliver a long, rambling political defense. He simply asked the people of London to pray for the king. He stated boldly and unequivocally that he died willingly for the faith of Christ's holy Catholic Church. He then turned to the masked executioner. The man knelt in the straw, as was custom, to beg forgiveness for the violence he was about to inflict. Fisher pardoned him completely and warmly. He knelt down in the blood-stained straw. He placed his thin, pale neck on the heavy wooden block. He prayed briefly. With a single devastating stroke of the heavy iron axe, the head of John Fisher was severed from his body. What immediately followed the execution was an act of profound, deliberate, state-sponsored humiliation. The King's Council, likely guided by the ruthless pragmatism of Thomas Cromwell, wanted to completely demystify the cardinal. By direct order, Fisher's headless body was stripped entirely naked. His frail, aged, and abused corpse was left exposed on the bloody planks of the scaffold under the hot summer sun for the entire day. Halberdiers stood a heavy guard to ensure that no sympathetic citizen could approach to cover him with a cloak. It was a brutal visual message to the public. This prince of the church is nothing but earthly meat. As evening finally fell, the executioners tossed the body roughly into a shallow, unmarked grave in the nearby churchyard of All Hallows by the Tower. There was no priest. There was no prayer. There was no shroud. But as we witnessed at the very beginning of this story, the Tudor regime's attempt to erase the cardinal spectacularly backfired on London Bridge. The state had expected his severed head, displayed on a prominent spike, to rapidly decay into a terrifying deterrent. Instead, it refused to rot. To the deeply religious people of Tudor London, this defied the natural order. Later, Catholic martyrologies and historical whispers claimed the face retained a vibrant rosy hue, with the eyes staring fiercely across the river toward the royal palaces. Whether this was a bizarre biological anomaly caused by the executioner's preservative salts, or a phenomenon heavily magnified by the desperate faith of a grieving public, the political result was undeniable. The macabre sight completely paralyzed traffic across the Thames, transforming a calculated act of psychological terrorism into an unauthorized holy shrine. Exactly 14 days later, a panicked Tudor government secretly ordered the head tossed into the dark waters of the River Thames. King Henry VIII successfully formalized a chilling era of state terror. He fundamentally reshaped the English landscape and bent the laws of the realm to fit his own desires. But he entirely failed to erase the symbol he had created. The quiet, stubborn scholar outlived the tyrant's legacy. Exactly 400 years later, in 1935, the Catholic Church officially canonized him as St. John Fisher. Ultimately, the Tudor state's brutal execution of a frail prisoner was permanently transformed into an eternal testament of unyielding intellectual integrity.